Hello and welcome to Take 5 with Dr. Chauhan. I'm an adult psychiatrist who has started this video series to discuss and learn about various challenges faced by students and their parents, especially those from immigrant backgrounds. I would request all viewers to subscribe and to comment to add to this discussion. Today, I have with me Aditi Sen Gupta, who's a junior in high school from Charlotte, North Carolina, and Mahad Niazi, who's a junior in high school from Jacksonville, Florida. Let's start the conversation. And today we will be talking about the challenges of standardized testing. We have divided it into three parts. We will first be learning from Mahad and Aditi about these tests. So this is more targeted at parents so that they better understand what these tests are, what is their significance, and what are the challenges associated with these tests. We will then be talking about strategies to foster communication between parents and children with regards to these tests and the stressors associated, not only for the students, but for the whole family that revolve around the testing scores and such. And then we will briefly touch upon strategies for students to reduce their stress prior to these tests. So I will first start with Mahad and have him tell us a little bit about these tests, specifically what he would like parents to know about these tests.
All right, thank you. So the SAT and ACT, they're both standardized tests required to get into college. You don't have to take both, but it is recommended that you try both to see which one you perform better in. SAT is out of a scale of 1,600 points, where 1,600 is a max you can get. It's divided into two categories, math and reading. So math, you can get an 800, which is a perfect score, and reading, you can get an 800, which is a perfect score. While ACT is a scale out of 36, it has math, science, reading, and grammar. These four sections are both out of 36, and it is more tailored toward like specialized tests in a sense, or students that are stronger in the science category. And one thing I want parents to know for sure is that they can take it as many times as they want. If they get one bad score, it's not the end of the world. I've gotten a bad score on the SAT. You can take it over as many times as you want until you're satisfied with the score. And they also do something called super score, which is basically, let's say I got a 31 in my reading section for the ACT. When I take it again and I get a 28, that 28 won't appear when I send it to a college that accepts super scoring. And I'll have a 31 there instead of a 28. So those are just some of my basic thoughts.
Sure. Aditi, you want to add to it?
Sure. So standardized testing in general, when you look at things like the SAT and ACT, it's important to remember, I think, for parents and students alike, that that number is not a holistic view of your achievements. It's one test, as Mahad mentioned. I think we tend to hyperfixate on that number, that final score. And it's not something I'm saying is a bad thing. I'm definitely guilty of it myself. I just took the March SAT. And I can definitely say I was very, very focused in on I have to get a good score, has to be, as close to 1,600 as possible. It's important to remember that there are other factors in your application that will also play a hand. Yes, it's good to have a good standardized score, but your number is not who you are. And I think it's important to remember that. The second thing I would say is when it comes to preparing for these tests, such as the SAT and ACT, it's always a good idea to start early, I would say. But it's important to remember that the more stressed out you are about the test and the more negative emotions and feelings that you attach to the test itself, the worse your preparation is going to be, the worse your performance is going to be. If you walk into the test freaked out about getting a 1,600 or freaked out about getting a 36, you probably won't get those scores simply because you're not going to focus to the best of your ability. So I would say managing that also.
Sure. And we'll talk more about it later on as we continue our conversation. So, in terms of taking the test, of course, this is something oftentimes immigrant parents don't understand, because in most countries where what we call, for example, in India, an entrance examination to get into colleges, it is either based off of your high school grades, or it is based of what is called an entrance examination, and it's a one-time deal. It will be repeated 6 months later or a year later, and you might not be able to get into a college for that period of time till you have an opportunity to take it again. So that is something that parents might have a difficult time understanding, especially immigrant parents. The other part is that I got curious about, as Mahat was sharing how these tests work. Do colleges know how many times a student has taken the test, and does it in any way impact whether or not they will get into a good college?
So I can add on to that. I don't believe they really care how many times you take it, because let's say ACT, you start off with a 24 and you take it 5 times over and you get up to a 34. The college could recognize that pattern of improvements. And if you combine that with a good essay talking about how you always strive to improve, that can create a strong college application. Versus, let's say, a student who has always gotten good grades and they get, let's say, 35 constantly, and they have a weaker essay, someone who gets a 34, like I said, could get in over that person who got 35. In college, getting into college isn't just about numbers or GPAs. It's a combination of multiple factors.
And to add on to that briefly, I think that plays into what Dr. Chauhan was saying earlier about how it's, not treated as an entrance exam as it is for many immigrant parents. I think both the pro and the con of the education system here is that there's more to it than your exams. And that can make it confusing. You are not always certain what factors play into it. We worry about our extracurriculars and our other projects besides our grades and our tests. But that test itself is not, a one-time thing. It's not the only factor. And definitely what Mahad was saying about perseverance to improve your score, colleges will see that as a benefit. So there's more to it than just, I took it once, got a bad grade. I took it again, got a good one.
Sure. So tell me about, from your personal experience and what you have heard from your peers, about what happens in a household, especially an immigrant household, with regards to these tests. What kind of challenges the two of you have faced or have heard from your peers, both immigrant and non-immigrant families. And I'll start with you, Aditi, on this one.
Sure. So I think, especially in my personal experience and my class, we had a section of children who were signed up for something called Duke Tip, which was, a talent development program separate from our academics. And they suggested we take a pre-SAT in 7th grade. So that was the first time I took some form of the SAT at all. And I think from then on, there was always, at least in my house, this idea of that is something that needs to be prepared for. I started studying very heavily starting 9th grade with the intention of taking it in 10th grade. For me, that was last year, so the pandemic definitely made a few changes to my plans, but it's always been kind of this inevitable big test that's going to determine whether or not I can get into a good college. And I'm not going to say that's completely on my parents. That's definitely something that we, as students, me and my peers, put that pressure on ourselves too. But I think my parents just not knowing exactly how the SAT or ACT is evaluated in the college process, they were definitely concerned about it. My dad would at least once a week ask me, have you taken an SAT practice? Have you studied for it? And I would say that constant, worrying about it adds to the anxiety factor that I was talking about earlier, where I was so worried that I wasn't doing as well as I could.
Right. What about you, Mahad?
So my personal experience, in my household, I haven't been too pressured to take as many practice tests as I can. They say that as long as I try my hardest and make sure I can do the best I can, they will be happy with that. But I am friends with students who are in the top 10 of my class. So I have friends who get 1550s, 35s. I think I know someone who got 36 on the ACT. So I have more pressure from my peers rather than my family. Mm-hmm. And I'm surrounded by, let's just say my school doesn't have the most diversity. So their type of culture is much different from mine. And the students actually place more pressure on themselves then parents put pressure on them. So like Aditi was saying, definitely the anxiety of knowing that the test is coming up, I'm eventually gonna have to take it. If you take it like earlier, let's say 10th grade, that definitely does take some anxiety away. Like for me, I took the ACT first time my junior year. So I did have some anxiety, but after taking it, I realized, oh, it's not too hard to improve as long as I just study consistently.
Right. So I guess the one of the consistent themes that I am hearing is, despite the fact that at some level we know that tests are not the be all and end all, whether it's coming from the family, whether it's coming from peers or both, there is a certain sense that, well, this is really important and we have to work hard towards getting good scores. So then I will open it up to a broader sort of, let's start to think about broader aspects of standardized testing itself, right? So what have you guys heard from your peers in terms of how much distress does it cause or not, right? To prepare for them, their reactions when they get their scores, and how do they cope with it? So I would like to hear from both of you on that. Mahat, go ahead.
Yeah, so the friends and peers I'm surrounded with, there's definitely a lot of anxiety towards the test. I personally am stressed out from having to study for the ACT for, let's say, about 4 hours every Sunday. So it definitely does cause some anxiety. But when it comes to getting scores, I personally check it the second they're available. I have a few friends who are extremely anxious. Their day is kind of ruined by knowing that the score is there, it's available. If it's bad, what's going to happen? If it's good, what are they going to do from there? And it often causes people more stress getting the score rather than like studying and taking it, because they know that if it's a bad grade, they're going to have to study even more. So it's a unique case.
So then a follow-up is, you said that the test can be taken several times. And if you didn't score well the first time around, especially if it was not up to your expectations, does it not increase anxiety to take it again?
I'll let Aditi go ahead first.
Well, just to briefly address that follow-up, I don't know if I speak for everyone there, but I will say from what I've seen with my peers, those who ended up taking the SAT twice and being disappointed in their first score didn't improve much. And I think it wasn't for a lack of studying. I think I can attribute that to them being worried that they'll have a similar outcome. But if we look at standardized testing in general and how that impacts, studying for it, getting our scores, like I mentioned, I very recently took the March SAT, which the results were supposed to come out on the 26th. The night of the 25th, me and a lot of my friends, we realized we weren't feeling too well. The usual heart rate's kind of high, can't really eat. I woke up at 2 a.m. on the 26th, and I was like, scores aren't supposed to come out yet, but maybe I'll just check. And I texted a few of my friends, every single one of them was up. Anybody who took the SAT and was expecting scores was up, 2 a.m., and we stayed up till 5 a.m. when the first wave of scores could be dropped.
Right.
And that entire day, we were just checking at random times, trying to see when the scores are coming out. We were worried about it. And I don't think it's much of a relief when you get your score, just because even though I'm satisfied with the score that I got, I keep thinking, should I have done better? Could I have done better? What did I do wrong? Which I would say that mindset is pretty persistent and pretty consistent amongst all my peers too.
Yeah, it's easy to imagine that, if the distress is high the first time around, and if you don't do well and you work really hard, you go and take it again, not only you will feel more distress when you go take it the second time around, but perhaps even more distress when the scores are going to be announced. Go ahead, Mahat.
So going back to what Aditi was saying, a lot of my friends, they had issues with getting their scores. So throughout the day, they'd keep on checking. There was more errors and more errors until they eventually got it. And the ones who got good scores were extremely relieved. And some of them knew that they could do better, so they're contemplating taking it again. And my friends who got scores they weren't satisfied with were pretty upset. they knew they had to study more, so that kind of ruined their mood. And it was overall a very like weird situation seeing all my peers who got really good scores. Like I know someone who got a 1490 and yet they weren't satisfied. So I realized some people put a lot more pressure on themselves
Right,
than they really need to because they
right.
hold themselves at such a high expectation, which at a point I think is unhealthy. But it happens unfortunately a lot more than most people think.
I may add to that really briefly. I think that's a valuable lesson that we hold ourselves to a very high standard, specifically, I think, in South Asian communities. Um, like Mahad was saying, there are some of us who have very satisfactory scores and are still contemplating taking it again. I'm one such student, and I'm wondering whether or not it's worth it to work a little harder for those extra. Maybe it won't be that much of an increase, even maybe it'll just be 10 or 20 points.
Right.
But that's another question that comes up after you get your scores that just adds to the anxiety, I would say.
So that's the fascinating point, right? So let me go back to where we started this discussion from. While we are logically, we know, talking of overvalued ideas, logically, we know that tests are not the be all and end all. We know we've gotten a good score. And yet there is this sense of not quite, right? That there is something better or there is something more that can be achieved. The curiosity that I have is this because you both are first generation immigrants. I know personally both of you. I know your parents immigrated here, just like myself. Uh, or do you find that amongst your peers who are not children of immigrants, the level of competition, the sense of there is, we need to improve our score. I know we will be generalizing, but still, do you feel that there's a marked difference or there is not?
So I'll start this off. At my school, we actually have more students. We have a 4.0 GPA than students have less than that. So students recognize the large amount of competition they have amongst their peers. Every single year, it becomes harder and harder to get into like these top state universities like UF, FSU. FSU had around, I think, like maybe 60,000 applicants this year, which is ridiculous. And students are now realizing that they have to do more and more to be recognized by these colleges. And to be recognized, they think they need an extremely high SAT, ACT score. So the stress keeps on building and building every single year. And progressively, they get this idea in their head that they have to get a good score, or else they won't be able to get into a good college.
Right.
Right. If I can add on to that, I would say my school is a little more diverse when it comes to our testing and grade point averages. That being said, something that you'll notice is that I don't know if this is because we are first generation immigrants or if it just happens to be, a cultural thing as South Asians and Asians in general, I would say, is that we tend to talk about tests more. And that's just something that, I have had many conversations with my Indian friends about, when are you taking the SAT? What are you doing to study for it? Dude, am I doing enough to study for it? Versus with friends of other ethnicities. I will say there's also a tendency for like people at the top of their game to be sharing their scores, which forces others to kind of, it gives them perspective on where their score lies. This is something that I see more in the South Asian community, and I don't think it's healthy for some students to, be looking at, oh, they said they got 1570s, 1580s. Not everybody's going to get a 1570 or 1580. And that's something we logically know but refuse to internalize.
Right. All right. So switching tracks a little bit, I think we have recognized very well that, um, and at some other point we can talk about the whole idea of standardized tests, the pros and cons of those, but they are a reality, right? We recognize that they are very stressful, both preparing for them, waiting for the results, the discussions in the family about these tests and their relevance, the pressures we put on ourselves, the pressures that we feel from our peers, pressure we feel from our parents. So how can we reduce this stress? How can we better understand the relevance of these tests, how can we better communicate with our parents. Um, and I will share my thoughts about it, but I would like to hear from you guys first, and I'll start with Aditi.
Sure. So I think there's a lot of layers to how we can feel better about tests. Starting first off with parents, I understand parents would be very nervous about these tests, especially if they don't, you know, feel familiar with the content or the value that it will hold in the admissions process. I think it's important for parents to recognize that their children has a lot to offer beyond their testing score. And I think it's important to, talk to your student about whether they have good scheduled practices or if they're, studying consistently without necessarily pushing them too hard. Conversely, if you're a student, start early, start studying at, I would say a good amount less than you would do if you're cramming. I did, an hour a week for 1 year and then moved it up to, an hour a day when I got closer to my testing schedule.
Mhm.
In terms of just maintaining your anxiety, I think it's important to remember that you will get a score, and that score will not be the end of the world, no matter how good or bad it is, and that you can always improve from that score. And I think it's important to not compare yourself too heavily to your peers. Yes, I definitely looked up what the average score was for the colleges I want to apply to, but I did not ask my peers what their scores were because that I think it creates unhealthy, comparisons that will just make you feel worse.
Mhm.
Whether or not people did better than you or worse than you, I think it's important to recognize your score and your improvement should be measured separately from them. And also, every time you do well on a practice test, I would celebrate. What I ended up doing was every time I got a score that I liked on my practice test, I would, take a break from studying for maybe for 2 or 3 days, or maybe do something fun. Just rewarding myself a little bit keeps it less stressful and a little more enjoyable, I guess.
Sure. What about you, Matt? What
So
strategies have you
adding on
used?
to Didi would said was a way to manage stress is definitely like you said, starting early. That definitely takes a lot of stress out of the grade that me and Didi are in currently, which is junior year, which is by far the most important year of high school. And your classes get much more difficult than sophomore and freshman year. And then adding on to that is ACT and SAT preparation is needed a lot more than sophomore and freshman year because this is the year when you want to get your good grades, your good scores, and start building your extracurriculars while managing a lot of things. And what parents should recognize is that you shouldn't always tell them to keep on studying, keep on studying. They will get burned out, and this isn't their main priority. It should be grades over their scores in some sense.
Sure.
Yeah, that's it.
All right.
Yeah,
So let me then try to summarize what you, Aditi, I'm sorry, were you going to say, add
I
something more?
I think that's a valuable thing that Mahad said that parents, you can encourage your kids, and there are definitely some students who are going to need a little more pushing than others to study. That's universal. But I think something to recognize is that most students are putting that much pressure on themselves, regardless of what their parents say. So that constant reminder or that constant, talking about the test over dinner, even that can lead to insane amounts of stress for a student. So I
All right.
think it's important to recognize that for
Oh,
parents.
and could I add one more thing?
Absolutely.
So students are now feeling that they look more like a number than anything else to college applications. And it can actually be seen as the opposite, as I know colleges in California, they don't require the SAT anymore. And that brings up the factor of your college application as a whole, as essays, extracurriculars, and especially how you stand out from the other applicants. So some students, they prioritize the SAT, ACT a lot more than they really should be. Let's say if you have like a 1450, which is a really good score, and they're focusing mainly on just getting up to like a 1550, that be seen as unnecessary in a sense because these extracurriculars will make you stand out a lot more than a really high SAT, ACT score.
So I think you guys both make very valid points, and it makes certain things very clear to me. one is the difference between learning and testing, right? So um, while it is important to prepare for these standardized tests because it does reduce your anxiety when you take those practice tests, especially if you can simulate the practice environment, because then you know what to expect, you know how you respond to challenging questions, and you can strategize. What is more important is what are you learning, right? Are you reading for the test or are you reading for learning? If you're reading for just the test, if you're reading for preparing for getting a good score, learning is not fun anymore. Reading will not be fun anymore, right? School will not be fun anymore. It will all be for the service of getting to a certain imagined finish line, which no one even knows is exactly what is the significance of that, right? We know that for some colleges, yes, there is a certain cutoff or certain average, but how many, how did they get to that average, right? Was that average defined by one or two or a very small n of very high scores and then other scores were lower? I don't know how much they share that information. So we know that there is some significance for these tests, but they are not the be all and end all of college applications. So that's one big part, that ability to step away from the situation as it relates to tests and be able to say to ourselves, we are reading this, we are going to school for learning. Testing is a part of it, but we are not going to school or we are not reading just to perform in a test. And that's, of course, something we have to understand as students, and most certainly parents have to understand. So the question at the dinner table is not what kind of score did you get in your test, but perhaps the question at dinner table is, what are you learning nowadays? What are you excited about, right? Uh, what do you want to do with that, right? Do you have ideas that you want to share? And that will make the dinner table conversation much more pleasant and reduce the overall stress in the household, and will make learning enjoyable, right? So that's one important part of it. The second part, I think, as Mahat pointed out, and this is again a whole topic in itself that we can discuss at some point of time, is this idea of perhaps colleges also recognizing that human beings are not numbers or a collection of numbers, right? While the number of applications are ballooning, so I understand from their perspective also that they have to create some mechanism to filter out students. But maybe there has to be a discussion about not using these standardized test scores as cutoffs, or making those cutoffs reasonable, so that all different variety of students have an opportunity for their applications to be reviewed, and their extracurricular activities and their not just the grades themselves, but who they are as a human being to be assessed through their essays, through their other activities, extracurricular activities, or other projects that they have done. So I think that's a broader discussion, but it is also something that we need to start talking in our families, because, as you said, it is an important part of college applications. Once again, what are we passionate about? What do we want to learn about? What do we want to achieve? And how we can take all of those things and actually um, uh, target it towards our college application, so that while we are doing things that are fun, that are enjoyable, that are motivating, that are exciting, yet we translate them into a college application. And that is something that, again, perhaps the preparation needs to happen, you know, not just at the very end of the college application process, but from the very beginning. Um, and yes, I know that there are some checklists that everybody has to complete, the volunteer hours and things like that. But I guess the most important part is to start exploring what are the things that students are interested in, and sort of having that conversation with parents and counselors and teachers, and starting to build that profile. The last part is sort of very practical, very specific as to what to do about the tests, right? So one, again, cognitive thought is, this is a test. This is not a decision about my abilities. And this is not the be all and end all. There will be other opportunities to take the test. So just simply setting that cognitive framework, I'm just going to go try it out, see what happens, right? Can reduce the stress level and actually improve performance, right? So that's one. Even if you're going into it the second time, doing a very careful analysis of what are the areas where you found challenges, even if you, especially if you felt like you did well on certain portions of the test and scored poorly, then perhaps it's not about your knowledge, it's perhaps about your test taking strategies, right? About, especially with these multiple choice questions and such, perhaps, having someone who has had, we've talked about peers comparing with each other, but there's an opportunity to say, okay, well, how did you approach these questions? How did you approach these topics? How did you answer these questions? And learning from each other, not competing against each other, but joining together to help each other perform better. Um, of course, we all know, I think this is preached in schools now, teachers know it, students know it, you gotta sleep, easier said than done. You gotta eat, food. And I personally, from my sort of entrance examination experiences and such, my take always was stop studying a day or two before your standardized test, because you will study, some things you will recall, some you won't recall, and suddenly you're more anxious, and then anxiety, instead of being optimal, reaches to a place where it actually starts to interfere with your performance. So those things, I think, broadly are extremely important. Any last thoughts from the two of you?
Let's see. Like you were saying about the studying 2 or 3 days before thing, that definitely is a really bad thing. If you study the night before, you're gonna be thinking about it all night, even
Right.
more than you should be. And that just causes you to ponder what will happen if I get a low score, what happens if I get a high score. It just creates unnecessary thoughts that you don't really need the night before a large test.
Sure.
I think one thing that I want to say, specifically to parents, is I completely recognize the stress that parents are under, and I see exactly why they might be pushing their student. And I would just like to, I guess it's not much, but I would like to reassure them that your student will take the test, they're going to get a score. You might not be happy with that score, they can take it again, they can study, they can improve, and at the end of the day, your student is going to do well if they study, regardless of the external factors. And once again, that score does not define them. So it's something that we prepare for, but we don't worry about, is the distinction to draw.
Yeah. And one more thing to add, parents, do not compare your children to other children. Let's say you are friends with a family whose student got a 1600. Don't compare your child to them. It's ridiculously hard and nearly impossible for some people to get a perfect score. So just be happy with what they get and make sure they're improving over anything.
Right. So I think that's Mahat made the most important point. One is that these comparisons really do not help. They cause unnecessary distress. And there's a need for recognizing that knowledge does not always translate into the score, right? That there are so many factors when you're going for a test, your test taking anxiety, your ability to sometimes, just able to effectively use strategy of exclusion, right? Even if you don't know sometimes a particular topic very well, some people just have that skill of excluding out things and getting a high score on a test. They might actually have less knowledge, and yet recognizing the importance that this is the world we live in. We might have our objections to the process, but this is the process, and taking early steps to prepare, and might I dare say even enjoy the process of standardized testing. And this can only happen if dinner conversations and family conversations are not about comparing, contrasting, focusing on a number, but they are about learning and knowledge, and even learning the strategies to take tests better. That's perfectly fine. And then accepting whatever score we get, and building on an effective college application. All right, great. This is awesome. I am going to stop recording now. Um,